Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ACLU Leadership Forum. For those of you who haven't joined us before, as Makiba said, my name is Deborah Archer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the president of the ACLU. And I'm so glad to be with all of you today. And I'm so grateful to see really the record number of RSVPs and questions and engagement for this event we hold, especially for our major donors, because these are really, truly challenging times. We are not just in the fight of our lives, we are in the fight for our lives, for our communities, for our rights, for our democracy, for our future. And these are all worth fighting for. And in the face of an administration whose goal is to scare us into silence, we have to recognize the power that we have. As Alice Walker once warned, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And that's exactly what this administration is counting on, that we'll be too exhausted or too overwhelmed and too afraid to fight back. But we're not giving up, we're rising up, we are speaking out, we're taking action, and we're seeing the administration back down in important areas and important ways. And to dig into some of the ways that the ACLU is responding and what we're seeing, the movement we're seeing in this administration, I'm really grateful to be joined by two amazing colleagues. First, Ben Wizner, who's director of the ACLU Center for Democracy, and Sophia Lakin, director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project. Benna and Sophia will talk about what they're seeing and what they're doing, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. As with all of our leadership forum events, I'd like to remind everyone that this is an off the record conversation. So if you're a journalist among us, welcome. I'm glad that you're here. But please note that nothing said here is for attribution or citation. And again, if you have any questions during the program, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And as I mentioned, we've reserved time at the end of the program for Q&A, and I promise we're going to try to get to as many as we can, along with the pre-submitted questions that we've had. So with that, let's get started. And I want to start with discussing something that I think is on the top of minds for many, many people, especially in the last couple of weeks. And that's the administration's efforts to silence critics and dissenters. So last week, we saw the Trump administration's FCC chair threatening ABC, leading the network to pull Jimmy Kimmel's show. And then hours after, the ACLU released a letter with over 475 artists and 40,000 people condemning Kimmel's suspension, ABC announced that the show would return to air. And of course, this wasn't the administration's first attempt, and it won't be the last attempt to pressure private companies into punishing employees for speech it doesn't like. So, Ben, your team is working tirelessly to protect our free speech rights. Can you give us a sense of where all this stands? Can you help us make sense of what we're seeing?
I can try. And thanks, Deborah, and thanks to everyone for being here. It seems like a lifetime ago when President Trump, on his first day in office, actually signed an executive order purporting to protect free speech rights and to prohibit anyone in his administration from acting to censor Americans' free speech rights. And since then, of course, we've seen the most comprehensive censorship campaign in modern American history, which is aimed at identifying and silencing any sector of society that might dare to oppose the president, from the media to private law firms to our independent universities. The good news is that when the entities that are targeted by this censorship campaign go to court to challenge it, they win. We saw Harvard University score a very important win in its lawsuit against the Trump administration's efforts to really take over the university on flimsy grounds. Four law firms that were targeted by executive orders that chose to challenge those rather than capitulate all won resoundingly. We have won when we have represented immigrants who are being detained and threatened with deportation because of their free speech. And some of my colleagues are in court in New York in the Court of Appeals today arguing in those cases. But this time it's the government appealing because we won below. But of course, the aim of this censorship campaign is not necessarily to win in court. It is to chill people more broadly and to push powerful sectors of society to do their own censorship. And so the FCC, of course, would have lost if Kimmel or his Disney had challenged it in court. But what Trump is trying to do is tell those powerful entities, you're better off complying. And that's why, in addition to that, legal challenges, the activism, the organizing, letters, the petitions make such a difference because I'm convinced that Disney changed its mind not because they suddenly analyzed the First Amendment jurisprudence, but because their stock price started going down, because the public was deeply offended by this heavy-handed attempt to censor a comedian.
Yeah. And we've seen that capitulation and compliance doesn't actually save you from the wrath of this administration. But I want to stick with the last point that you just brought up around the power of people kind of expressing their voices and speaking out. With a government that's intent on suppressing speech it doesn't like, there certainly are uncertainties about the role of protest and public pressure. People don't know if it makes a difference. They don't know if raising their voice is worth the risk. We received a question from Ellen S. ahead of today asking if we should continue protesting and writing to our representatives. So, can you speak just a little bit more to the power of protest, especially in this moment?
Yes, I mean, it's so important. I would venture to say that it's even important for our litigation, for the judges to understand what political context they're operating in. I remember back in the first Trump administration when we were litigating against the Muslim ban, and there were thousands of people chanting outside, and that creates an atmosphere that can give the judges courage to do the right thing. So many people in our society are not political. They just want to be on the winning side. And if they think that Trump's successes are inevitable, then they're just going to go along with it. And if they see, as we saw some months ago, millions of people in the street opposing it, as we're going to see later this month, maybe the largest street protests collectively in American history, that's sending a message, not just to policymakers, but to other citizens in our society, which is what's happening right now is not inevitable. The success of these moves is far from inevitable. It's contested, and the hope is that that kind of courage is actually contagious. And I can say from all the traveling that I do around the country and speaking to people, that message really does get through.
hmm We're talking a lot about power centers and the work that the administration is doing to undermine power centers, but we forget about the power in our communities. So I appreciate you reminding us. This is sure to be a recurring theme of today's call, and it's certainly a recurring theme in our work, and that's the need to pull on every lever and to use every tool that we have to stop the administration from seizing power, from upsetting our system of checks and balances, from trampling on our rights. And one of those levers that we at the ACLU use very frequently is litigation. But as you know, we continue to field questions about the power of the courts. We received a lot of questions about the Supreme Court, especially after the recent rulings related to ICE's consideration of race and racial profiling in indiscriminate stops. And it's a question that I get when I'm out in the public as well. So, Ben and Sophia, can you both outline our pathway in the courts to protect and preserve our rights and go into some detail about why people should still have faith in the courts?
Well, sure. I'll jump in here, and I just want to say this is a question I hear all the time. Is litigation still an effective tool, or do we have to just go on a general strike? Is this the break glass moment? And I can really say emphatically that litigation is still an extremely effective tool. And despite the well-reported misconduct of the Trump Justice Department in various court cases, they are overwhelmingly following the court orders that we secure against them. And some of these numbers are really eye-popping, but we have filed more than 80 lawsuits against the Trump administration in 8 months. For those of you who are attorneys, you'll understand just how staggering that number is. And in more than three-quarters of the cases in which we're seeking injunctive orders, we're seeking orders from courts to halt the administration's conduct or to require them to do something. we're winning. Now, look, the Supreme Court's going to reverse some of them. It's going to uphold others. Our job, at least while there is unified Republican rule, is to throw as much sand in the gears as possible with these cases, to slow them down, even if we might lose the case 2 years later. But at least, slow down some of these harms until other help is on the way. But we have been nimble. Sometimes the Supreme Court will issue a ruling and we'll have to file new cases the next morning, and our lawyers will stay up and do that. One advantage of the ACLU is that if they fly our clients to other states to try to take them away from their lawyers and family, we have lawyers on the ground who can meet those planes and file new lawsuits there and represent them. So I really think that's an important message, which is that again, we won't win every case, but litigation is still one of our most important tools.
And Sophie, if I can get you to chime in and talk about voting generally, but particularly in the redistricting space where it can be hard to keep up. We had a Supreme Court win in 2023, a loss in 2024, and then now we have a reargument in a case where the Louisiana State Supreme Court ruled in our favor. And we are saying that there's a pathway in the courts. Ben said that quite clearly. But what he also touched on was that it doesn't mean there's a straight line, that there's the path, but it's not a straight line. Sometimes it's two steps forward, one step back, as is true with the nature of progress. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
You're absolutely right. The pathway isn't a clear one, but we're still finding ways to deliver wins for voters, even in this hostile federal court environment. We've been dealing with this for some time, so this isn't necessarily new. And I just want to echo Ben within the specific context of voting rights, but just to give you a sense of scale here, we've filed or intervened in 36 lawsuits just in voting in the Voting Rights Project over the last 18 months. And despite those challenges, we've been able to obtain positive outcomes for voters in 2/3 of the cases. I just looked at this last night, and that's just so far. And we're still waiting decisions in several cases. And this includes some landmark wins in just the past few weeks, including successes in the federal courts on redistricting from with wins in our Louisiana and Alabama state legislative cases, and another one in our challenge to the Mississippi State Supreme Court district line. So while you're hearing a lot of news about this re-argument that we have in a case out of Louisiana dealing with congressional lines and how consequential that might be, at the same time, we are still achieving wins under the frameworks that are being questioned and at issue in the Supreme Court. So we're continue to push despite what we're seeing all around. We were also investing pretty heavily to talk a little bit about our nimbleness and our willingness to continue to find new pathways. We're continuing to build cases in state courts where we just had a big win in Pennsylvania, ensuring voters get notice of ballot errors so they can vote provisionally or challenge their disqualifications. And what's interesting as well is when I've talked about this in prior meetings and calls, but we've been pushing new legal theories for some time. We've pivoted in recent years to diversify our docket. So we're now in the process of defending some wins on these new legal theories, like our challenge to Georgia's ban on providing food and water to voters waiting in those notorious long lines. We won that on First Amendment grounds, not traditional voting legal theories. And we have had wins to an omnibus voter suppression law in Texas under the Americans with Disabilities Act. These show that we're finding ways to open new doors when others become closed or become stuck. But here's the reality. Well, while we're doing this more typical voting rights work, we're always doing this work. We're also having to adapt quickly to challenge the Trump administration's attacks on voting rights. And that means, again, using different tools, adapting, being nimble. We're raising separation of powers arguments against the president's anti-voting executive order. We're filing comments in the Election Assistance Commission to lay the groundwork for potential future litigation in administrative processes. We're challenging mid-decade redistricting in state court under state laws and state constitutional theories. We're using FOIAs and FOIA litigation when needed to press for much needed transparency, becoming experts in the Privacy Act and state privacy laws to ensure voters' sensitive data is being protected. And that's just to name a few of the different kinds of legal arguments and theories that we're prepared to deploy as necessary, especially as we're gearing up for the elections both this November as well as for the critical midterm elections in 2026. So no, the pathway isn't clear or straightforward or well trodden, but we're using every tool in the toolbox and finding new ones when we need to, and that's what this moment demands.
Yeah, well, I deeply appreciate your nimbleness and your creativity, because if voting is the foundation of our democracy, I think we have to acknowledge that the foundation is crumbling, or at least is at threat of crumbling, and the work that you're doing is so incredibly important, as you said, with elections coming up in November and then the midterm. So thank you. Ben, I wanted to follow up on something you said. Earlier, you said that in the majority, overwhelming majority of the cases, the administration is complying with court orders. But a follow-up question that I get often, and I'm sure that you get often, is what are we doing in the percentage of cases where they're not? Or what are we going to do when they don't? Because there are lots of fears of non-compliance. So can you talk a little bit about how we respond to the administration not complying with court orders?
Well, of course, this has been a huge concern. The open defiance of, let's just say, a Supreme Court order would be a constitutional crisis of different magnitude than we've experienced. And so all the groups have been mobilizing to prepare for this. But I will say that so far, when push comes to shove, the administration has backed down every time. And even in the highest profile case, the one of Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, where they said he will never step foot in this country again, we don't even have any control because he's been sent to El Salvador, and that's a sovereign nation. They reversed course and brought him here to face criminal charges, where he has a right to counsel and can make his arguments in court. Our clients who were sent to the notorious prison in El Salvador have since been released from that prison. Now, not back to the US where we think they should be, to Venezuela rather than to the United States, but we continue to push on this. So every time they have blinked, they've talked a big game about how courts can't constrain them. But if you read the briefs that they're writing to courts, they're not saying that we can defy you. They're saying that we will follow your orders. And look, um, I think part of this is that the institutional Republican Party has no incentive to see the courts weakened. They spent a generation putting conservative judges in the judiciary and getting a supermajority on the Supreme Court. And they don't want to see Trump leave office with a weaker Supreme Court rather than the strong one that they have right now. So, look, in the event that that happens, we will tell you that that's the moment for everyone to be in the streets. But for now, I think our worst fears about noncompliance with judicial orders have not come to light.
Yeah. And they're not unfounded fears, because we see what is put out on social media, but it's important to remember that a social media post is different than what we're seeing in the courtroom. So thank you for that. Sophia, I'm going to give you a quick break because Ben has opened up the door to talking about immigration. And I want to dive into that a little bit, but we'll get back to you in 1 minute. So, Ben, I do want to ask you to discuss this administration and the attacks on our immigrant communities in horrible and heartless ways, arresting people who are showing up for mandated court appearances, those who are doing what others consider to be the right thing, inhumane detention facilities like Alligator Alcatraz, and right here in New York at 26 Federal Plaza, and excessive use of force. Can you walk us through how we're challenging this incredible range of actions and violations?
We are, and remember, this really is the core of the Trump administration's plan, which is mass deportation. Their goal is to deport 1 million people a year, and the limitation on doing that is that we have legal processes in these countries that make it difficult. We don't necessarily have enough detention facilities to hold people who are arrested, and their solution to that is open cruelly inhumane ones like the notorious Alligator Alcatraz, stuff people into holding areas in the immigration courts at 26 Federal Plaza. We've filed a pile of lawsuits. It's hard to keep track of all of them. We got an excellent injunction a couple of weeks ago where a conservative federal judge in New York said that the conditions at 26 Federal Plaza were inhumane and ordered all of the relief that we had asked for in terms of reducing the population and giving people better conditions. We have 2 lawsuits about Alligator Alcatraz, one saying that the entire facility is unauthorized and shouldn't be allowed to be open at all, and another dealing with the conditions there. And we've also challenged the awful practice of arresting people who are showing up for their court dates. Those in New York will remember that mayoral candidate Brad Lander himself got arrested escorting some of these people at 26 Federal Plaza. That litigation is still ongoing, but we are doing everything we can, both to improve the conditions that people are being held in, and to essentially, all I can say is slow down the deportation machine.
Yeah. And so much of it is about sowing confusion and fear in immigrant communities. And we're seeing that in other communities as well. We've seen this show up, particularly in Black-led cities, right? With the recent militarization of DC, plans to repeat that in other cities, and threats to do the same in Chicago and New York. And the administration has a playbook for how they're rolling this out each and every time. Can you walk us through, again, what's at stake, what are we seeing, and what's the ACLU's response?
Yeah, and here I want to say something maybe a little different, which is that it's possible to look at Trump's deployments of National Guard in American cities as a sign of weakness rather than a projection of strength. And what I mean by that is that it's immensely frustrating to a would-be authoritarian leader that almost every police officer in the United States reports to someone other than him. And it must be even more galling that they're reporting to black mayors in these cities, and that he doesn't have the unilateral authority to step in and take control of those police forces. And so this is a kind of lashing out, a kind of attempt to be like the leaders who he admires in other societies who do control their ministries of police. But we don't have a massive federal police force in this country. We have state and local policing. And so you see this playbook. I think part of the goal is to provoke the kind of response that would then justify an even more violent crackdown. And I think we've seen a lot of discipline in these communities in protesting these deployments in the right way. We have been litigating against it where possible. And I would expect that we will see some litigation in Oregon, where there is a recent deployment from our ACLU affiliate there, as well as in other cities. At the end of the day, the Constitution gives people the same rights, regardless of what uniform people are wearing, regardless of what kind of weapon they're carrying. And so we'll be on the ground, particularly protecting people's right to protest, protecting the media's right to cover all of this, and bringing lawsuits where those rights are violated.
Thank you. Something that you've mentioned a couple times, I just want to highlight that it's important that we continue to remind people that success in this moment, right now, may look different or feel different. At the ACLU, we're defining success as defeating, diluting, or delaying these abuses of power and trampling of rights. Each defeat, dilution, or delay sends a strong signal to the administration, but more importantly, a delay means that there's more time, more days, weeks, or months where someone is able to enjoy their rights, where we have stopped the violation of the rights. Every effort to dilute an action by this administration means that there are more people whose rights have been protected. And so I appreciate you reminding us of the different ways that we have to view success. So Sophia, want to turn back to you to discuss a little bit more efforts to protect voting rights, especially in light of Donald Trump and his allies' efforts to rig the system. In Texas, we were seeing proposals for a mid-decade redistricting process, which could significantly impact the balance of power in the U.S. House. And then meanwhile, there are plans in California to counter Texas's maps, intending to add 5 Democratic-leaning seats. What is the ACLU's view on all of this, and how do we see this playing out?
Yeah, so let me be direct about what's happening here. Trump and Texas have opened a Pandora's box in an effort to rig the upcoming midterm election, ensure a compliant Congress that will rubber stamp the Trump administration agenda. And now we're watching this play out across the country. This isn't business as usual. Trump and Texas and now others are pursuing mid-decade redistricting solely for partisan gain, not to reflect communities better or to adjust for population shifts. And in most instances, voters of color are bearing the brunt. So it's a transparent power grab. We've got political leaders in DC they've been gutting healthcare, tearing apart families. We've just talked about this with abusive deportation squads using federal power for revenge and personal gain. So maybe it shouldn't be too surprising that rather than earning electoral votes by engaging with constituents and championing policies that improve people's lives, they've chosen simply to redraw the district boundaries. But we have to be honest about the dynamics that we're seeing here. We recognize at the same time that not all states taking action right now are similarly situated. Some are instigators, some are responding. When Trump and his allies are using this process to rig elections, it's really entirely foreseeable that other states like California would respond to counter these actions to ensure fairness at a national scale. From our perspective here in the Voting Rights Project, at least, we're prioritizing what we've always prioritized, and that's protecting the voices of voters of color and pushing back against egregious moves to diminish their power. So in Texas, with these new maps, the new map that has been put in place, voters of color are bearing the brunt of the manipulation. And we filed an amicus brief supporting those challenging the map, which is currently having a hearing right now as we speak. And this continues Texas's long history of racial gerrymandering and voter suppression. In Missouri, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, Missouri has itself engaged in this process. We're challenging the new map in state court. The new map dismantles the Kansas City-based congressional district they have there, cracking it into 3 different pieces and splitting them between 3 very rural districts, all to unseat one of Missouri's 2 Black congressmen. And in doing so, it's really diminishing the voices of one of the state's significant Black population, and does so along racial lines. In one part of the city, the new lines bisect Black and white neighbors, literally placing different racial groups on opposite sides of the track, using a historic racial segregation, residential segregation line. So unfortunately, Trump and Texas's race to the bottom is spreading. Even more states are contemplating their own mid-decade redistricting gambits. To a large extent, I'm going to say that this falls at the feet of the U.S. Supreme Court, which closed the federal courthouse doors to policing partisan gerrymandering. So the ball is in Congress's court to act, to end this madness and protect the freedom to vote for all Americans. And we're actually seeing some movement from representatives from both parties trying to stop what Trump and Texas have started. And I hope that's a sign for some optimism here. You know, as we say time and time again, the people should be choosing our politicians and not the other way around.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And particularly thank you for reminding us that racism is a thread that runs through so many of these actions. And I think we often have lost sight of that in the conversation about what's going on in this administration. But along with map meddling, Donald Trump has called for a new census that excludes undocumented immigrants. And this follows his attempt to include a citizenship question in the census during his first administration, which the ACLU successfully defeated at the Supreme Court. Can you talk about why the administration is so focused on the census? What is their ultimate goal?
So the interference, the focus on the census, it's fundamentally about power and political control, like so much of this. What they're trying to do here is gerrymandering on a national scale. The goal is to shift political representation away from diverse communities and cities where many immigrants live and redirect that power to areas more favorable to their agenda. So by erasing millions of people from the count, they can steal representation from communities of color and immigrant communities. And that's definitely all by design. But it goes deeper than congressional seats. That's what we often talk about. The census determines billions in federal funding for schools, hospitals, Medicaid, disaster relief. When you exclude undocumented immigrants, you're starving these communities of essential services. Low-income communities and communities of color get hit the hardest, and then that's going to be a recurring theme here. And here's what people need to also understand, though. This doesn't just hurt immigrants or undocumented communities. I think that's sometimes we lose focus on this. It hurts millions of citizens and voters living in those same communities, including Republicans. Professor Justin Levitt put it well when he says, we're all tethered by the count. Exclude undocumented immigrants from a city, the suburbs that depend on that city lose out. They depend on the city as an economic engine. They're going to suffer too. Rural communities that rely on farm workers also lose out. Erasing people from the count hurts all of us. So this is really part of an anti-immigrant agenda dressed up as policy. To erase someone from the census is really to deny them as people. They're deny their humanity, to deny their presence here. And our country really has an unfortunate history of trying to say that some people just don't count as people. And this unfortunately rings the same in that reprehensible tradition.
Yeah.
The courts have seen through this before. I think there's some cause for optimism here, and we're prepared to go back to court if necessary. The Constitution and 230 years of precedent are very clear. Every single person living in America must be counted, not just citizens, not just those with papers in order, everyone. That's always been the rule, and nothing the president can say can change that.
Thank you. I'm going to pull it out just a little bit because as we're approaching next year's midterms, many folks are worried about the electoral process broadly, federal interference. People are worried about intimidation at the polls. We've also received a question from Barbara about having free and fair elections at all. And so what is your response to those fears?
I completely understand those fears. They're real and they're valid. People are right to be concerned about federal interference and intimidation at the polls. But here's what I want everyone to remember. The administration wouldn't be doing any of this if there wasn't real power in voting. They're attacking voting rights precisely because they know how powerful your vote is. So think about it. Why else would they be working so hard to make it difficult? Why else would they be trying to intimidate voters or interfere with the process, to rig the process? It's because when people vote, when communities organize, when we all participate in our democracy, we can change outcomes. And that's why they're working so hard to stop us.
Yeah.
What I'll add to, as Ben flagged more broadly at the beginning of this briefing, we've already had significant early successes pushing back against this administration. In the voting sphere in April, we won a major victory when a federal court put a preliminary block on Trump's attempt to mandate a documentary proof of citizenship requirement on the federal voter registration form by the sweeping, unprecedented executive order trying to usurp Congress's role and power to regulate elections. And this wasn't just a procedural win, it was a clear message that the administration can't simply override the Constitution and federal law. So Trump tried to mandate this requirement that could disenfranchise millions. We said no, the court said no. So yes, the challenges are real. The threats to our electoral process are serious. I don't want to understate that. But to Barbara and everyone else wondering if we'll have free and fair elections, we're going to certainly fight for them every single day in the courts, at the ballot box, in our communities, because of course that's what this moment demands. And because your vote, the one they're trying so hard to suppress, is exactly the tool we need to protect our democracy.
Absolutely. And, it goes back to something that Ben was talking about earlier, and that if we cross a certain line, that it may be time for people to take to the streets. And Ben and I were together over the summer, and this question was raised. And I don't know if Ben, if you wanted to add anything to all the responses that Sophia has already contributed.
Just to say, I hear this question presented even more bluntly. Are we even going to have elections in 2026? we are absolutely going to have elections in 2026. They are going to be contested elections. We're going to fight for our rights. If they try to interfere with those in a substantial way, the people would not tolerate it. Even in many of these societies that we think are on the wrong side of democratic backsliding, Turkey, Hungary, they still have very contested elections that their leaders are afraid of losing. It's not easy just to turn off something as powerful as elections in our system. We will be there. We will be heard. Sophia's team is doing absolutely heroic and historic work to make sure that everybody will have a chance to be heard. But I don't want us to participate in this kind of surrender and defeatism to say we've already lost, there won't be an election. No, in our system, the people always have another move, and that move is coming up soon.
Right. Thank you. And as much as the administration is trying to erase and exclude communities by stoking fear, at the ACLU, we're going to do everything in our power to ensure that we, the people, means all of us and that all of our rights continue to be protected. So I know we received a lot of questions related to that ahead of the event. So why don't we turn to the Q&A? And we're going to kick it off with some pre-submitted questions, but everyone should feel free to use the Q&A function to ask any questions that have come up as a result of this conversation. And of course, there may be some questions we can't get to today, although we have a good amount of time, so I'm hoping we can get to all of them. But if we don't get to yours, we'll be sure to follow up after the event. And again, to our journalist friends that have joined us on the call, that nothing said here, including in the Q&A, is for attribution or citation. So Makiba, I'm going to turn it over to you to share the first batch of questions.
Yes, so for the first batch of questions, the first one is from Carol. Is it legal to arrest people while not identifying themselves with a badge number or other identification? From Denise, voting rights barriers like banning mail-in ballots and voter ID requirements affect all voters, including Republicans. Do you have any thoughts on why the Republicans are pushing for these barriers, knowing that it impacts everyone? And from Will, how is the ACLU using messaging to try to drive public opinion around all of these aggressive and unpopular actions by the administration?
Shall we jump in, Deborah? Okay. Well, why don't I just take the first question of arrest? I think probably most people on this call will have seen videos of plainclothes law enforcement, unidentified in unmarked cars, wearing masks, grabbing people on the street, including our clients, shoving them into cars or vans and driving them away. This is an unbelievably dangerous practice, especially in a society that is armed lawfully because of the Supreme Court. And I worry that we're going to have a situation where someone thinks they're being kidnapped and uses deadly force here. Now, there is a bill in Congress that would require federal law enforcement agents to take off those masks and to identify themselves. We already think that in many situations, the law and Constitution require such identification, but it's clearly the policy of this administration to do that. Now, their justification for these masks is to protect the security of the officers themselves, but I think something much more sinister is involved, and that they want to sow fear in communities, and they are not offended by the comparisons to militarized dictatorships that disappeared citizens during dirty wars. This is the kind of force that ICE in particular is trying to project in communities. We will continue to push. At this point, the president unfortunately has a congressional majority that makes it almost impossible to pass the kind of remedial legislation that I have in mind. But I don't think most Americans want to be policed by people wearing masks. And if we can't, get this victory legislatively, we can still mobilize public opinion against it.
And I think I can hop into a question of regarding why are these voter suppressive mechanisms being pushed continuously when they impact everyone and not just certain voters? And I think, I think traditionally, unfortunately, and even in a Supreme Court argument, a lawyer for the Republican Party sort of said this out loud, that there is a belief that when fewer people vote, that one party does better than the other, interestingly. Whether that actually plays out with the data, when you think about the popular vote in 2024 and how that played out, is a different story. And Ben and I have talked a little bit about this question of, is there more work that can be done? For example, who is using mail ballots? Who is voting? And how are these different rules actually impacting all voters pretty aggressively? Would that help move the needle in terms of reducing interest in suppressing the votes and ensuring that there's access for everyone, getting back to a time where we're trying to win people's votes, not trying to suppress those.
And can one of you speak to the narrative change piece, the messaging, because narrative change, storytelling is such an important part of our work. Which one of you wants to jump in on that?
I will a little, just to say that we have an extraordinary communications department at the ACLU, more than 50 colleagues who are the top professionals in their fields. We even have within that department a storytelling team that specifically is trying to help us on an issue like immigration. Our clients themselves don't have the right to vote. And they depend on our being able to mobilize and modify public opinion at scale. And to do that, to make the story not the one that Trump wants to tell about gangs invading us militarily, but the one that is in plain sight, which is communities being torn apart, people being arrested at their workplaces, people being separated from their children. And other loved ones. On something like militarization in our streets, the ultimate battle is over public opinion. I don't think we can depend on the courts to save us from Trump deploying the National Guard. At the end of the day, will the public accept Trump's argument that he's responding to a genuine emergency, or will they see through it and realize that he's actually trying to provoke a kind of response that will be helpful to him politically? And I also will say that I think our litigation is an extremely effective communications tool, and that allows us to mobilize around the really compelling stories of our plaintiffs as well.
And I really love that question because it's so important for us to tell true stories about the breadth of the impact. Sophia was talking about the census and people not understanding the real breadth of the impact that a change to the census would have, and to be able to tell the stories and to provide that narrative is important. We saw that around the Medicare cuts. That was important to really be explicit about who was going to be impacted and how they're going to be impacted. Makiba, a second batch of questions?
Yes, so the first one up is from Alan. Does the ACLU cooperate and coordinate with other like-minded organizations with legal actions? From John, what are the likely big picture damages we may find at the end of Trump's term, and which can we reasonably expect to be reversed? And then from Neela, the balance of power is already stacked against communities of color because of the Senate. White rural voters have much more power than the rest of us. It's minorities rule. In the long run, what can be done?
Sophia, do you want to start with cooperation and coordination?
For sure, for sure. Absolutely. We spend a great deal of time trying to, I think, expand and magnify the efforts of, I think, like-minded organizations, democracy organizations, racial justice groups, to try to expand what we're able to do and cover the field. We can't all do everything. And even within a litigation, if you have multiple groups a part of it, we're working there to say you're going to cover different things, to try again to be able to be as impactful across the board as possible. And a ton of work and resources is spent on ensuring that we're moving strategically in lockstep, including not just in legal actions, but for sure in legal actions as well, so that we don't get also I think, conflicting rulings. We're trying really hard to stay on the same page, but also with respect to organizing policy work and behind the scenes work with states and the like.
So let me take on big picture damage, because I have the reputation around here of being the organization's optimist in chief, but I'm not Pollyannish. And there are ways in which our country is never going to be the same, and we need to acknowledge that. I mean, for one thing, our reputation in the world will never be the same because we now have 3 consecutive elections in which we either elected Donald Trump or almost elected Donald Trump. And so, for better and for worse, we are moving to a more multipolar world because of the actions of this administration. I think things like destroying USAID, that's going to take more than one administration to rebuild, having real foreign aid in this country. I think the attacks on the federal workforce are going to take more than one administration to rebuild. We've seen tens of thousands of people lose their job. We've seen agencies be completely gutted, and we've seen massive harm to, middle-class communities who depend on those kinds of jobs. And obviously, there are harms that are irreparable. That's a legal term. But when families are torn apart and people are kept in cages and they are deported, even if we're able to change the policy, we're not able to undo the harm that was done to our clients. Now, I do hope that we'll be able to rebuild free, uncensored scientific research. I do hope that we'll be able to restore our universities as beacons where the best and the brightest from around the world want to come here. But I have concerns about those kinds of things. Our job is to make sure that the constitutional rights landscape is restored. And that's where actually I am most optimistic that much of what we're seeing from Trump we're going to be able to hold back and turn around, and that partly that's because the public broadly is going to reject this in the next couple of elections. I think there is a question about voting, about the Senate.
And I think that is unfortunately grounded in our founding documents, this sort of inherent inequity, essentially. And I think part of all the work that we're doing here to try to ensure that people are speaking out, that they're trying to hold their representatives accountable to policies and issues that are important to them, are the way that we're going to be able to move, I think, the slow moving Senate to kind of move with the shift of how people really believe and feel and the policies they want to see in this country. But yes, it is a certain intrinsic mode of ensuring a certain kind of representation in this country. That's been part of our founding. I'm not sure that there is, other than holding a constitutional convention, which has been discussed and for many issues, a way around that particular item, except to use all the other tools that we have available to hold the Senate accountable.
Makiba, another batch? I think we have time for one more batch of questions.
Yes, these will be the last batch of questions from David. With so many pressure points at this time, it is easy to be distracted from focused efforts and have one's energies diluted to the point of becoming ineffective and feeling overwhelmed. What advice do you have for us to remain focused while being responsive to changing priorities? And from Catherine, what is the most urgent action we can take in our communities to help? And then finally, from Curtis, considering this dire chapter we are living in, what good news can you share with us at this time?
Well, I guess these questions are related. Certainly the first two are. How do we deal with this flooding of the zone? And the zone is not just all the things that we're seeing happening in our country, but this invasion of our minds and our brains with news every day. And I mean, I'm sure that there are people on this call who have wisdom to share on this. This is not the province of lawyers. I'll tell you the way that we do it in the office is that, we understood that there is no way we can respond to everything. And so we put our heads together, decided what are our most important priorities, and let's do as much as we can in those areas. Now, for us, that means litigating cases. If you're a university president, that means figuring out how you're going to deal with it when the pressure comes for you. If you work at a law firm that is targeted by Trump, how are you going to respond in this moment? I really do think that people will be judged by how they responded when it was their turn in the spotlight. And that's why I think it's, sort of so important for people to understand that um, there are high costs of capitulation that might actually turn out to be higher for you than the cost of resisting, and to make people understand that resistance is important. That when you look back on this time, you're going to be you're going to want to be one of those people who resisted. Now, it might not come for all of us on this call as directly as it came for law firm partners, or as it came for scientific researchers, or as it came for universities, but it might. And the key is to be ready and to know, sort of who you need to be at this moment. We're not all called upon to do everything, but we might all be called upon to do something. And that might actually even just be acting through organizations like ours that are the experts on this. I certainly don't express my full political identity through the ACLU, and have other organizations that I support that deal with other aspects of what I care about. But it can be difficult, and I will just say here on the good news. Look, this is an unpopular presidency. I do think that I've spent much of my career being on the minority on some issues. I think this is a time where it actually feels like there is momentum behind us. There's momentum behind us politically, and there's momentum behind us in the courts. And it doesn't always feel that way because of how much power our presidency has, and how many ways that Trump can change the subject and do new depredations and deprivations. But look, I do think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, and I do think that we're going to prevail.
Ben, are you not going to also deliver the good news?
No,
Was that not the good news? I mean, look, the good news is we're winning a lot. Um, uh, is there new good news from today that I missed, Deborah? Well, I will
No, I'm
actually
just
say some
saying
good news from today. I will say
Curtis
some good.
wanted good news, so I
Yeah,
wanted you
here
to
is some
give
good
Curtis
news
some
today.
specific
Today,
good
a
news.
federal judge in Massachusetts issued a 161-page order saying that the Trump administration's policy of targeting non-citizens for deportation because of their political speech violates the First Amendment. He's been a judge for 47 years. He said this is the most important case in his career, and wrote a passionate opinion saying that the First Amendment belongs not just to citizens, but to non-citizens who are here, and that the administration has been lawless in its attacks on our clients. That was just today. The good news is that lawyers from my team and Sophia's team are in two different courts right now, pressing important arguments. Basically, any day that we have one of these calls, there will be ACLU lawyers in a court making arguments, and more likely than not, winning.
Yeah. And that is good news that I'm glad you shared, because we don't hear about it in the news. The media is not reporting those victories as frequently as they should. So I appreciate you sharing that. And thank you both. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Sophia, for taking time out of your very busy schedules. I know your plates are overflowing, so I appreciate that you took time to join us. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us today and sharing your questions. Again, if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email us at leadershipforum@aclu.org. And if you're interested in joining us for that fight, we encourage you all to sign up for our People Power Movement, which is ACLU's network of grassroots volunteers. And I encourage you to attend your local No Kings mobilization on October 18th. We so appreciate your engagement, your support, your activism. We are stronger together. We're a stronger ACLU because of you. And we're grateful to have you all in this fight with us to protect rights and to ensure that we, the people, does mean all of us. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next time.